All right, Alice, we got 16 folks on the call. You're the boss.
Oh, I'm definitely not the boss, but
Should I get
please,
started?
please start.
Everyone knows you're the boss. What are you talking about?
Please begin.
All right. Good afternoon again, everyone. My name is Jimmy Hung, he, him pronouns. I'm from the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. I work here in our juvenile division. I'm also a member of the Partnership Council on Juvenile Justice and an honored co-chair of this committee with my esteemed colleague, Clinton Taylor, assisted by the wonderful team led by Alice Coyle at DCYF. Again, welcome to our committee. As many of you guys know, the Partnership Council, we advocate for youth justice, alternatives to incarceration, and system improvements. Our work centers around reducing the impact of racial and ethnic disparities across all systems. We know that addressing the issues of racial and ethnic disparities is not ever easy. The good news is that progress can and has been made by systems and communities working together to help reduce and even in certain situations eliminate disparities. Over the past couple of years, as I've served on this committee with Mr. Taylor, we've worked very closely with our Washington State Center for Court Research, our friends like Dr. Peterson, who's on the call that I saw, where they're making juvenile data more publicly accessible. The law enforcement data dashboard is now available and online, and within the next few years, we will include data on referral and diversion, detention, prosecutorial filing decisions, and confinement and admissions to our juvenile rehabilitation. The Washington Juvenile Justice Data Dashboard Initiative aims to fill an important gap in our knowledge of our juvenile justice system and helps us with the larger work of comparing decision point data in order to understand where disparities are persistent and where we are making some progress. And so to this end and towards this mission, we are honored to have Dr. Thaddeus Johnson with us today. Dr. Johnson is a national expert and professor on police policy and innovations, urban violence, crime control, and racial disparity and justice outcomes. And Dr. Johnson comes to us from Georgia State University. He's going to present to us today on using data to understand the mechanisms of racial disparity and criminal justice system reform. And before passing the mic off to Dr. Johnson on behalf of the Partnership Council and this committee, I want to extend our deep appreciation to Dr. Carl McCurley for inviting Dr. Johnson as our speaker. And I want to thank my friend, Les Liggins, for facilitating the logistics to get Dr. Johnson to be here with us. So with all of that, I want to turn the attention over to Dr. Johnson.
Thank you all so much. And you all can just call me Thad. That's what friends and family call me. So Thad will suffice. And, you know, talking with Les, speaking with Alice, and even the invitation that were received by the doc, just really felt at home, felt like I was among friends and like-minded people who are in it for the same thing, to try to understand justice and reform and inequities, but doing so in the way that we call balls and strikes, right? Where we allow evidence to lead us and allow our hearts to help us understand the picture. And so just appreciate the opportunity. Before I get started, I'm going to introduce my wife, Dr. Natasha Johnson, the other dreadlock on the call. You all see, wave, Natasha, can you wave? There she go. You know, we do a lot of our work together, and the work today is going to reflect a lot of our insights from our research together, and also our research with our partner, Dr. Bill Sable, who's a former BJS director. And Natasha has been working, has a background in education from New York. She's worked with special education populations, She's worked with high-risk populations, been an administrator throughout the school system, and she's in the criminal justice department, the criminology department, and she has an education background. And our research looks at social justice and leadership, but our research particularly also looks at how systems, laws, policies, how these things work together are impacted, but also help perpetuate many inequities that we see. And understanding, the truths behind it. There's a lot of these things, differential treatment, is a differential enforcement, is a differential involvement, or is it that the justice system oftentimes play the cards or the hand that they're dealt by socio-political issues? And even if that's the case, does that mean that we're helpless? Our research says it's not the case. So a lot of the research is insights that we pulled together from our work. And I will say this, I'm presenting our work. It's not that I'm skeptical about a lot of research out there that looks at race and gender and these matters, because I don't think they're thoughtful enough. I don't think that they really try to add those souls and treat those like souls behind the data and not just as data. There's different ways to weight things, to really understand, to not chop the data up in order to manipulate it, but use it in a way in which we can really understand and simulate real life and not just to get a publication. And so with that being said, that's where I'm coming from today. Hopefully you get a chance to hear from Natasha at the end. I grew up in the Baptist church down south of Memphis. So, when the visitor pastor come in and you say, hey, pull this coattail. So Natasha, she's on the other side, pull my coattail if I get too long-winded, unless shoot me a text as a virtual coattail pulling if I need it. I have about 20 slides. I know I have about 35 to 40 minutes, and I hope not to bore you, but I really want to hear from you all, because I'm not here to tell you anything. This is how we do things, and this is how we kind of paint the picture together. I will say, you all the ones doing the work, and some of the work that we've done with the Council on Criminal Justice, looking at the impact of statute changes on disparities and equities and justice. What we found out that many of the laws came behind the change, meaning that the people were changing. The laws simply cemented the practices that were already taking place. And so that's to be applauded. And I'm a former police officer, police commander out of Memphis, Tennessee. And so, this is kind of our second career for both Natasha and I. So we're just honored to be among colleagues and so thankful to be here. So with that being said, it's not about me. It's about, having this conversation. So it's a little bit different. I'm going to kind of paint a picture of how we do things and try to understand things and how it leads us to our conclusions. I'm going to go ahead and share my slide. Look, I'm already rambling on too much. Let me share my slide. Hold on. Okay, I think that's it. Okay, I have a pretty slide I made up, okay, just for you guys. All right, hold on. Got a lot of data for you. All right. So the one thing, and you all also mentioned, I know you have the data dashboard, and you're really trying to understand how can you use the data that you have, what data should you be collecting and thinking about. And that's the one thing why I really want Natasha, we have time in the end, why I said to pull my coattail, is particularly with juveniles. The data I'm presenting is national data, and it's a data they're dealing with adults, right? But these same things can be applied with juveniles. In particular, with being in one state, you have a little bit more control of not trying to have to make it look uniform to other states, right? Some points we're going to talk about, maybe, we do work on zero tolerance and expulsions and disparities in that and how it contributes to social inequities like violent offending and all these things. And just knowing that many times students who drop out of school, or individuals who make their way through the juvenile justice system, they have either had an IEP, they've been expelled, they have a history of that. How can we try to understand the backgrounds of these people so we can have earlier intervention and do real analysis? So I'm Natasha's co-pilot on that work, and so hopefully we'll have time to talk about that, but I digress and we'll move on. So today, I'm using various data sources like the National Correctional Reporting Program data. I'm also using UCR data, using the National Crime Victim Survey data, census data, in order to make these calculations. And so these first couple of slides is just a little bit of housekeeping. And so the one pressing issue in CJ and public safety is equity and effectiveness in curbing disproportionate levels of community violence. Now we know that certain communities, and I'm talking today mostly in terms of Black and white, and this is why it's national data, unfortunately, like arrest data. The FBI didn't really start collecting good ethnic data until 2013, and a lot of that's missing. So it's sort of tail end of our analyses. Also, there's an issue of measurement. Depending on what measure and combination of race and ethnicity that you use, dealing with the Latinx and Hispanic populations and not to deal with multiracial groups, it can determine the equity picture. And so when I'm talking today, I'm talking about non-Hispanic white people and non-Hispanic Black people in these rates. I just wanted to set the stage for that. Not that I'm not acknowledging that, I can't make up data, right? And so that's really what it is. And this goes to show how much more data that we need and why the efforts that you all have in your state with this dashboard is utterly important, and don't think it's a small feat. Understand the role that it really plays in us understanding and getting people help, because it's not a overnight thing, right? Unfortunately, that does look for people who are suffering inequities and victimization at this moment, but we have to think long term, and you have to have data, and you have to have better data and enhance that and enrich it. So I just want to applaud you all for what you all have done. Moving on, I want to just real quickly, when I'm talking about measuring disparity, I'm going to talk about various measures. I'm a nerd. I'm a data nerd. I had no idea. I hated math coming up. I happened to marry a high school algebra teacher, of course, math teacher, of course. No, sense of humor, right? So I want to really just make sure that I kind of lay some things out to make it easier for me to discuss these things. So when we talk about disparity ratios, we simply took for instance, with arrests, the number of Black arrests divided by the Black population times 100,000 Black residents to give us their rate per 100,000. Same thing for the white rate. And we divided the Black rate by the white rate. And so what you get is this ratio where 1 means you have parity. If it's above 1, say for instance, 5 to 1, that means that Black people, in this case, are arrested at a rate 5 times higher than that of white people, right? Or if you have something that's less than 1, it means that the biases, quote unquote, favor Black people, if that's for lack of better terms. Okay, so I'll do this with admissions, and there'll be some other, we'll talk about length of stay. And so just kind of just take you on this journey. I know it's a lot of parts, but I promise you all, if you to stay along with me, I'm going somewhere, I think. Okay, so also before I move on, and I hope that this is the first of many conversations, because I think it's even like just having an hour to sit together to understand how do you measure inequity? And how do you put these different measures of inequity together to understand what's the real inequity, right? And so one thing I just want you all to know, we use various, with a great lens to really paint an accurate picture. We use various denominators. And what I mean is, like, oftentimes when we talk about, for instance, from our policing research on police lethality, police deadly force, if you use a population-based denominator, as on the left-hand side, you see that in 2000 disparity ratio, Black people were 4 more times likely than white people to be killed by police. If you look over time between this period, it shows that there was a decrease in disparity. Well, if you look over here to the right, we use arrest base to try to account for differential exposure, because not all people have the same likelihood of coming into contact with police. It's a screw. Maybe we need traffic stop data that's a little bit better in these things, right, to really get an understanding. But if you look here, it shows that, yeah, the disparity ratio was smaller and the rates are smaller. But if you look at it mathematically, the disparity ratio is slightly increasing. And so we try to go through great lengths to present all the findings in a way that really makes sense. So I really just want to make sure show you all that I'm not making these things up and that we're not trying to paint a picture. This is where the data has led us. And I think that's important to put out from the start. I always tell my students, you need to make sure that you arbitrate people who come in front of you, right? That you make them lay out their credentials and lay out their perspective. And so I just really feel that's important. So let's start with the story about disparity and imprisonment and how it leads to interventions on the streets. So both relative and absolute disparity fell since 2000. Now, I'm going to focus on relative disparity, which was the measure I just showed you all, which would tell us how many times more likely or less likely. That's the blue line you see. But you also see the absolute disparity or the difference in the rates. It tells the same story. So you want to make sure you always utilize a different level or different type of measure of disparity to really understand the picture. And maybe the levels are off, but what's really important are the trends going in the same direction. And if not, what's going on? You can have a measurement issue, these things. And these are things I would love to come and kind of talk about and really nerd out with you guys for a little bit, if that's okay. So let's dig in a little bit. So between 2000 and 2020, the relative Black-white adult disparity in imprisonment declined about 40%. In 2000, Black adults were about 8 times more likely to be in prison than white adults in state prisons across the nation. And you see 20 years later, the Black imprisonment rate had dropped to being about 5 times higher than that of the white rate. Now, it's also, you want to understand what's going on underneath it. So really what happened during this time is that the Black imprisonment rates almost underneath this fell almost continuously throughout this period by almost 50% halving. And comparatively, the white rate fell by only 10%. So now you understand in trend-wise why we're seeing these changes, right? And also it's important, there was a different level of pacing in the decrease in disparity across the period, right? So looking at time differences. So in the early part of the period, the amount of decline mass in the first 5 years, in the latter 15 years, the same level of decline occurred that it took 5 years for the first part. So we had rapid movement during that first period. And so now you want to go back, well, what the hell was going on? And we've seen this in states across the US, this same type of pattern as we dig underneath and look at the different various states. So beyond breaking out from the overall imprisonment picture, what about the race by offense category? And what we saw declines across the board, but if you look with me to the left, you see that the biggest declines in disparity that we've seen has been for drug imprisonment across the US. And if you look at the blue line, it shows you see, remember in the beginning, I said one of the biggest issues is violent crime. The biggest disparity gap that we have in imprisonment now is for violent crime. Now, mind you, people will say the criminal justice system is highly decentralized. That may be the case, but its effects on the people that's involved in the system are cumulative and they're real, and they build up over time. You have disparities in exposure. You have disparities in criminal history. Now you have disparities in likelihood to be admitted. You got a lengthier criminal history, you might get more time behind bars. These are the types of things that it builds up across time. Then you may be less likely to get parole on the back end. And then how does it impact your reentry efforts when you're going back to the same communities from which you came and which you got involved in these things in the first place? And so this is why it's important to try to dig down underneath to see what's going on. I can even come and talk to you all and talk about the war on drugs. The war on drugs this decline is really being driven by the war on drugs being over in big cities. But when it ended in big cities during this time, we're starting to see in suburban and smaller areas, the war on drugs just began and seeing disparities increase. And so you want to understand geographically what's going on too. And we just kind of look at the whole picture, okay? And this just kind of gives you a picture of the underlying race and how these things are changing. You all have access to all of these things. And so I have links and notes at the bottom in which it really it gets into detail, what's going on with the rates, okay? Now, I will say that when you're looking at data and trying to understand data, you don't just want to have rates or just look at counts. You want to look at both, because I think sometimes we look at rates, one thing, it dehumanizes the data, right? And when you look at just counts, it doesn't account for secular changes. So if you bear with me and just kind of take a look at what you see with the violent crime for Black people up top, you see that the prisoner rate, the number of prisoners increased by almost 12% during this period, but the actual rate decreased. Then you see for white prisoners as well, for violent crime, the same thing, an increase in the number of bodies, white bodies in prison. And then you also see an increase in the rate. But if you look over at the population change, the Black population growth rate occurred faster at 33%. For white people, that growth rate was only 7%. And so by doing so, what we found out was that 50% of the disparity that we see in imprisonment was or changes were due to population changes. So now we know that we can cut that out. Now the other part has to do with the criminal justice system and other socio-economic and possible political factors. And so, oftentimes we don't talk about those demographic changes and even shifts that we may see. This is nationally, but what about the state? What about the local level? How do these impact numbers and things that we're seeing? So this is why it's important for us to see not just rates, but counts as well to understand the data that we have. As we go on, as we're looking here, So the size of the prison population, when we're thinking about, when we're looking at imprisonment, it's a function of not only the number of people admitted to prison, but also how long they stay there. Oftentimes there's a misnomer that the 1994 crime bill and the truth in sentencing laws, when these things became solidified and codified federally, because these practices were already happening in the states, as you all may be well aware, these things were codified into law. And what we saw was that we weren't necessarily having the same amount of bodies or people cycle through prison. What we were doing is a slightly less people, but the growth rate was increasing and the capacity was filling because we were keeping their people there longer. And we're stacking people on top of people on top of people. And so even when we're discussing it and all these things, we hear particularly when, the presidential election and Biden, the debates, they were saying, oh, it contributed to more people in prison. It was contributed to less people being there longer periods, and that impacts. That's what's underneath. So when you don't look at the trends and the sub-trends, it masks a lot of things. And it's not to give a person a pass or anything, but it's really to understand what's going on so we can help the people who are on the receiving end, who represent these data points. So as you see here, first of all, let me tell you, in 2000, the parole revocation rates. In 2000, Black people were much more likely to be revocated for a technical violation than for their white counterparts. By 2019, this is not on the slide, this is just me, I'm just kind of talking stuff now, I've gotten comfortable. And I have those slides at the end of here as well, so you can visit those at the end that you'll have in the packet. By the time 2019 came, Black people were slightly less likely than white people to be revocated. And so they said, well, so that means that, okay, parole revocation is not a common route anymore for people into prison, as it once was 25 years ago. And so now that we see is that it's admissions. And so even if you look at the admissions disparity ratio to the left-hand side, we see that the disparity ratio decreased, right? But look at it. The red line at the bottom is the white rate. The green line is the admissions disparity ratio, and the black or blue line is the Black rate. So what it shows you is the white rate was pretty much flat over that period. So the changes that we see in disparity was not due to changes in the white rates of admissions and decreases in the Black rate of admissions, right? Which was led by decreases in drug admissions. And even if you look on the left-hand side, when you're trying to understand the role of length of stay, we'll see that length of stay exerted an upward influence on disparity, meaning it contributed to more disparity in overall imprisonment, because the overall expected length of stay for Black adults increased from about 26 months in 2000 to about 30 months in 2019. And for white adults, it fell from 24 months to 21.6 months. You see why this will explain a growing gap in length of stay. And so even though what our research shows, even though there's a growing gap in length of stay, a big problem that we're still seeing that explains the majority of disparities because of disparities. The majority of disparity in overall imprisonment is because of the contribution of disparity in admissions. Even though it's decreasing, it still explains most of the disparity relative to length of stay, the overall imprisonment, if that makes sense, right? And this is how we're just trying to decipher and break on like what's going on and where's a place for most immediate intervention or long-term intervention. And this is where we're going with that. Also, we have to look at new court commits, because remember I told you that the majority of admissions were not for parole revocations, it's for new admits. So it's not recidivists per se for the same crime, it's people committing new crimes, right? Which to me is a little bit scary and goes somewhat counter to maybe narratives that we hear in the overall public and public safety sometimes, right? And so starting at the left, you'll see that this is for the new court commitment race, not disparity race, just the Black and white race, with the Black race being identified by the navy blue marker across these. You'll see that the race increased for both Blacks and whites with new court commits for violent offenses. But the levels are much higher and the rates are higher for Black Americans. If you look at the new court commit rates per 1,000 arrests, I'm sorry, these are new court commitments per arrest. And let me take a step back. So you have to get into, people just don't walk into prison, right? Oh, I volunteer, I need to be locked up, right? There's a process, right? And so their arrest occurs first. What we've been seeing across the nation is that even in places where we're seeing an increase in arrest for the arrest disparities for certain crimes, something's happening in court processing where we see reductions in the disparity overall in new court commits for arrest. So I don't know if it means it's lower quality police arrests. I don't know if it's more individualized judgment. I don't know if we're just only focusing on violent and most serious offenders, since about 2/3 of all prisons in the US, state prisons, are there for violent crime. But it shows the different mechanisms at play, from the police now to prosecutors, courts, and judges. Our data doesn't tell us what's going on, but it tells us something's going on to look at there. It could be pretrial things, we don't know. But also you'll see, if you look on for drug offenses, we see declines over time in the ratio of admits to arrests for Black people, a slight increase over time for white people. And also I will say for the drug arrest rates and even these admission rates that we're starting to see over time, these tend to align with an enforcement emphasis away from traditional Black drugs, crack cocaine, marijuana, to things that are more and less urban, to more rural, more historically white drugs like pills and synthetics and things of that nature, methamphetamines. And so I think a lot of this can be explained by this. It could be that some offenders are just getting smarter out of technologies at play. We don't know, but we're seeing changes around this. But you see how you can use data just at this point to understand, what's going on right there? Let me dig deeper. Let me talk to people who work in that space to see what was going on. Was its practices? I digress. You see, I get excited about this stuff. Right now we have, this is just kind of showing the same thing where you see the disparity ratio. Last slide, we saw the rates. Now we see the disparity ratio. And right now you see the green line for drugs is telling the same story. Property crimes, the disparity ratio of new court commits per arrest are decreasing. And you see it tells a similar story for violent crime, but look at the violent crime denoted by the black line. Every time we go over a chart, the biggest gaps or the increases or the counter narratives as opposed to the declines is with violent crime across every slide that we look at. So if violent crime is an issue, we need to look at, is this differential treatment or differential involvement? And I sometimes get in trouble with this because this leads way to a conversation that we kind of hide from and that we need to impact. And it doesn't have any racist implication. It shows that we need to think about how we intervene. We need to think about the services that we provide. We need to think about how we deal with communities, families, and people, and think about our role in some of the issues that these communities are facing as a system. So when we start looking at the disparity on the left-hand side is a disparity in estimated non-fatal violent offender rates. You see that the disparity is increasing. We also saw that disparity was the highest for arrest rates. So now what we want to see is this for drugs and property crime? Research shows pretty much unequivocally that, man, look, that's differential enforcement, oftentimes because for the foundationally, police resources are more concentrated in underserved communities, more opportunity for contact, not to mentioning how police reward officers, how they promote officers based on crime fighting, things that really don't have any public safety value. That's a whole nother conversation. But if you look to the right-hand side, what you'll notice is you'll see that the white arrest disparity per offender and violent victimizations. And what you see is that the arrest rate and the offending rates converge, meaning that the arrest disparities for violent offending is associated with disproportionate violent offending. Does everybody get what I'm saying? What I'm saying is that the Black community suffers disproportionate amounts of violent offending and victimization. And it doesn't mean that these communities are broken. It doesn't mean that Black people are inherently more violent. It reflects a lot of the socio-political issues and systemic inequities. I mean, hell, in these communities, the air they breathe is dirtier, leading to developmental issues and cognitive issues. So I mean, it's environmental, it runs deep. And so it's not finger pointing, but it's trying to lift communities up and understand why there's so much violent offending. Let me move on for the sake of time. This is nothing new. We know that this has been the issue across time. You know, one thing that we often don't talk about, you see this uptick for the pandemic effect, is that in places in our big cities like LA and California, our big cities like Chicago, and other big cities that for the most part for their full year, the increase was only felt in Black and brown communities. We had upticks for other races across other places, but in our biggest, most urban areas, that's where it was felt at. I think, was it 2/3 of the 7,700 more homicide deaths we had that year were young Black men between the ages of 15 and 34. Maybe it's a third, but you get the number. Disproportionately. That tells you right there, something's going on right there. And let me move on. But if you don't really understand and look at things beyond murder and homicide, if you look at the difference between 2019 and 2021, we focus on young Black men, but look at young Black women in their race for non-lethal violence, with robbery and aggravated assault between 2019. Look at white women. So we have violent crime pretty much decreasing and staying the same after the pandemic effect starts to reside about 2021 for white and Black men. But look for our women. The levels are lower, but the trends are troubling. And if you don't take an intersectional look at your data and collect gender or sex, or I'm always confused about the politically correct way to say these things, or race and ethnicity, right? All of these things. But if you don't capture how people identify and measure that and see what they're dealing with among those subgroups, we mask where real victimization or the most troubling issues occur. And these are ways you can move from just seeing disparities to trying to understand what's going on into the street and contributing to this. So we've talked about this right here. And of course, I'm going to return to that point a little bit shortly. What I mean by, of course, it doesn't mean they're broken or inherently more violent, but it means that we need to specialize and tailor a holistic approach to reform. So how do we further reduce imprisonment disparity based on what we've seen thus far? You need to reduce the disparity in rates of violent offending, in time served, which is connected to violent offending and more serious and differential exposure to the police, and the role of criminal history, which I just mentioned in sentencing, but not only the time you get, but whether you're able to get released early or not, based on parole and things like that. And so if you really want to reduce disparity and help communities, we have to somehow address violent offending. And so this is what I'll say about this real quick. People have been serving longer times behind bars than they ever have, right? We lock people up here more than any other country in the US, but we're still seeing these issues with violent crime. And so these are a couple of reasons why it's only temporarily works. People tend to age out of crime. So you got somebody in jail for 30 years, they're old man or old person by the time they get out, they're not doing too much more offending, not serious offending. And there's a smaller number of habitual repeat offenders who commit disproportionate amount of crime as well. And then you have the replacement effect. I always tell people, if we just simply focus on capturing the drug offender or capturing the gangbanger and not addressing the issues that gave birth to their behavior, if I'm a dope boy, I'm like, thank you, Mr. Police, thank you, courts. I didn't have to take them out. Now I can run the street, I can run the market. And so we have to take this holistic approach. And again, there's no clear-cut evidence that throwing away the key has sustainable public safety benefits for your grandkids, generations to come. Now, we need to take a more holistic and effective approach. And this is now moving from kind of getting to the questions about what reforms have worked. It's 3:37. I think I have the 3:45, and I think I'm right on time, if that's okay. So what we're finding, even in the work on recidivism and things, is that a lot of these things are beyond the justice system's responsibility, to tell you the truth, and pay grade, right? We punish well, we blame well. It's a blaming institution. And we've underfunded everything that helps prevent that or helps thwart that, including the justice system itself and all its other parts and affiliates and the work that's being done. And so there's ways like housing. If a person goes to prison, they come back and they want to do right, but they have no home to go to. They have no health care. They have a skill, but nobody won't hire them because they're ex-convict, quote unquote. What are we doing to fill those gaps? And it all does kind of point back to that. And our research shows that there are racial differences. And our research shows that public safety is not, it's a justice matter, but it's an equity matter across the board. So real quickly, to talk about what police reform has happened at that front end to kind of reduce that front door. Remember, admissions is the overwhelming contributor to this. And it's pretty much talking about really, violent crime and things, and how can you have both improvements in public safety and improvements in equity, and how do we use data to do this? Well, I'm going to removing the trigger, and what I mean is like lower level traffic stops, and we've seen this like in Philadelphia, some other cities, Memphis, mine, Less City, they're taking this approach. It's a short-term relief until we can get things right and better and figure it out, but it removes the trigger, because think about it, police officers don't do this job for free. Correctional officers don't do this job for free. They have mandates and quotas and things they have to hit. And so am I not going to make an arrest because I'm justice-minded when I got a wife and kids at home? When I got a mortgage, when I have a car note, when this is how I'm rewarded, this is how I can get out of South Memphis and get to a better shift in a less quote unquote violent neighborhood as an officer? We have to consider these things and look at how we reform industries. Is the same tenets we can apply to reform and justice, right? Because it's not benevolent work. As much as we all love this, we have to find ways to sustain ourselves and our families. And that's just reality. And if we don't work in reality, we set ourselves up for failure. Also, you can take a person, place, and time police focus approach. Now, I will say things like hotspots policing. I'm not going to go into depth, these slides are here. Risk terrain mapping and things. I will say that it's great so you can reduce the stop and frisk and reduce the number of contacts, right? That's great. But what if we did like Dallas? So Dallas, Texas, where everybody else during the pandemic saw an increase, they saw decreases in violent crime. Why? First of all, they started adopting and using data like in 2016. They had the political will to do so. But also, instead of just taking an enforcement approach, they went in and holistically loved on those communities, held those accountable who need to be accountable, brought service providers in for those who needed those services, and they saw those effects. And yeah, it's incremental, but you saw decreases. And if you only can reduce it by 3% this year, 3% next year, the cumulative effect of 5 years is a 15% decrease. How many lives is that? How much change is that? And how much more safer are we? We've seen places in Cincinnati that's taking these approaches, and I'm going to move on, but like in Cincinnati, yeah, federal oversight and consent came in, but they really took it, and you even had the unions involved. You had the courts involved. And what you saw was they took a less enforcement focus. They focused on serious crime, took a more intelligence-based approach. And what they saw was reduced crime. They saw changes in attitudes toward the police and citizens, more equity. And not only, I tell people, were there less use of force, but our officers were safer. We don't talk about that. How can we keep our officers safe when they face unprecedented levels of resistance, particularly in Black and underserved communities? And it's oftentimes not because of the officers, because of these systemic inequities and misconduct and treatment that we've seen across time. And they're confronting these things. So we have to address these things and change what we do based on the data, not just because of how it impacts the citizens, but also our citizens in uniform. All right, 4 more minutes. Newark police took a community form approach where one thing was it took a trauma form approach where they just talk to each other. Police deal with trauma all the time. You see people at their worst, traffic accidents, injuries, death. But these people in these same communities are suffering as well too. And both sides are suffering so much and hurting so much that they're against each other. Sometimes as simple as understanding and making each side human again. And so things like that, how they rewarded their officers. The state of New Jersey said you can no longer in police evaluations use a number of arrests, stops, and citations on how you evaluate officers anymore. Now you got to find other metrics that represents really the other 85% of police work. That's a great first step. Then you all have access to this. So what I'm saying is it's not just enforcement, it is not just holistic, but it's you need both of these things for sustainable stuff to happen. Other holistic initiatives were each one that worked in Oakland, Chicago, Nashville, Baltimore. They partner with police and the citizens work a community together. We make it too hard sometimes. Sometimes it's allowing people to do what they're already doing and rewarding them for it and prioritizing it. And you're seeing great impacts even across the pandemic and them being able to see reductions in disparities and equity across the board from policing up through jails and things like this. And the last thing I close out with my last 2 minutes is this. The federal government and police reform has failed. the George Floyd Act, all these things, right? And the bottom line is this: ban some chokeholds, qualified immunity. Look, and I'm not saying qualified immunity is like is a mixed direction, but cops not rich. Where are you gonna get money from? So what I'm saying is, it's like it's about holding them criminally accountable, decertifying them. And yeah, you want to sue them, I get it, but it's more symbolic than substantive. Let's quit focusing on symbolic things, right? What we need to do is revitalize our communities and say, oh, the money's not there. The federal government, just for Medicaid alone, annually wastes and loses to fraud and loss and excessive spending about $50 billion a year. Local governments at the state level yearly across the US, $5 to $15 billion that are wasted on building golf courses for already privileged groups when you have issues going on in the inner city. The money's there. Even when you see how we provide, and look, and I'm just speaking from, I'm just being real with you. I'm gonna get in trouble with my last minute, but that's okay. Even when you talk about to people in these communities, when you see foreign aid packages of millions and billions of dollars, and they're saying, where's the money at to build this park? Things like putting green space, community gardens in spaces have been shown to reduce violence, along with other aspects. And so it's making these investments. You know, we saw this in Eastlake. It used to be called Lower Vietnam or Lower War Zone during the Vietnam War era, where police would even go into this area in Atlanta. And what they did was they revitalized the community. Federal monies, the developers partnered with people who are on the ground, nonprofit schools doing the job. And what they found was now you have a PGA tournament that happens at Eastlake Golf Course now. No more food deserts. They have affordable housing, one of the best schools in Fulton County. It's over in that area. But the one thing, the question I'll leave you with, when we make these investments, we have to make sure for these interventions that we invest not only in places, but people. Because as this thing took time to happen overnight, the community became whiter and more educated. And a 22% difference. What happened to those people? We're yet to know. And so we need to make sure that we take a balanced approach in investing in people and places and partner with police if we want to have a more equitable and safer community. I am done. I am shutting up, and that's it.
Dr. Johnson, that's a lot of information to process. Thank you so much. I got a message from our committee chair, Jimmy, there's a fire alarm going on. So at this point, perhaps we entertain some questions. If anyone have any questions, please. And we also want to welcome Dr. Natasha Johnson as well, if you wish to make any criticism or remarks.
All criticisms, no, I'm just kidding. It's great to be here with you all, aligned with you all today. This is what we do. So it's what's better than one scholar in a household? Well, two. And so I, as Thaddeus said earlier, my background is in education. So this is year 22 of just being in the K-20 space and just aligning and connecting and building and growing in that. Those of us who are here, we're all allies, and it's just great to always, allyship is wonderful, and these are opportunities we have to just engage and move the needles forward and do the work we know, the higher level work we know we're here to do. So yeah, glad to be here with all of you. Thanks so much for this opportunity.
Yeah, and I will say that I know it's a lot of information, and today I really wanted to give you like a bird's eye view of how you can take data and how you can understand different points. And I'm sure that maybe the pieces that you picked up, many of you all were like, what's going on right there? Or some things, ideas may have popped in your head about what's going on in your communities and things during these time periods, or how the data you can have to understand like disparities, equity, where are the places to really focus on? And I think, you see how the work kind of came to form, and where it all goes back to taking a certain approach and how we don't have to subscribe to false choices of either improving public safety or improving equity, and don't anybody allow us to peddle that, excuse my language, that BS, and that we can have it all, and we should be working toward it all. There's many things in policing that we can come and just talk about, pure police reform, what has been done, and probably what's impossible, and what do we need to plan for, and what can we do in 3 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, instead of reaching for a pie in the sky. Let's lay these steps out there with data. And people say, we don't have data. Oh, we did get new data. I grew up in the South. You know, I grew up in the hood, and I didn't ask my mama for anything until I used the hell out of what I had. And so, you know, until you want more data and new things, you need to use and show that you're able to make things happen with what you have, to find those gaps, so we're not just asking the same questions over and over again. So.
Any questions?
Can we get this information too?
Of course, Billy. We'll be posting the recorded session as well as the PowerPoint. It will be shared. Mhm.
And what I do too as well, you know, this is the thing too, I enjoy this. What role does academia have to play in this, right? You know, we have all this information, these paywalls. Hell, listen, we in academia, there's some journals that we have to beg the editor, the publisher, like, can I see my own publication that I worked hard for and published with you, right? And so, you know, I feel like, you know, it helps to bring this information to bear. So I also will share a folder with you all with some of our works, and there are some works that I think that are behind paywalls may deem important, and also some reports that we drew from for this information, if you all think that would help.
Dr. Johnson, you gave some example and models towards the end of your presentation. Could you talk a little bit about how we can overcome sort of the challenges of building partnership with local law enforcement, especially in today's climate, right? There is a lot of challenges, unwillingness, and historical mistrust between community and police. Any suggestion?
Yeah, no, that's a great and powerful point. And so, mind you, you know, there's enough blame to go around, and part of this is having hard conversations with these communities. And I'm going to get back and talk to you about the justice system, but being a Black guy, I have no problem saying this, is that despite the pain and hurt that we have, you know, we have to be willing to draw a line in the sand at some point, and that's difficult. How do you get there? I mean, I think that's maybe one of the biggest and harder questions to get to, right? So I just want to acknowledge that, but I always say it like this when I talk to community members and police. It's like a cheating spouse. You know, if a spouse cheats and they decide they're going to stay together, and babe, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do it anymore, I'm not going to do it, you better damn well make sure that person doesn't do it anymore. But if you're going to, the aggrieved party, and you say we're going to work it out, then you have a responsibility to try to move on and pass that pain and that hurt and work it out for a brighter future. That's hard. That's not easy. So some things that police can do. So for instance, let me share a story with you. As a police officer, I remember, and this has kind of changed on the leadership path. I remember I changed a tire for this lady who could have been my mom's age. It's on the rush hour, it's raining. And I grew up watching Andy Griffin, Matlock, you know, Heat of the Night. You know, I got a certain, you know, helping the old lady across the street with groceries is real policing to me. That's how you get information and get your belly full, right? And so I'm out there, it's pouring down, raining. I'm changing the tires 45 minutes, and I'm talking to her. I'm soaking wet. And mind you, as an officer, you have to count for every moment you spend. I go back. I'm a young officer. I am happy. I'm like, man, I did some policing today. And my lieutenant says, I see you spent about almost an hour out here on this call. I forgot what the code was. He said, what was it? Oh, Lou, this lady, told her I changed the tire, this and this. And this was his response. This is quote unquote. So, you know, I got a potty mouth, forgive me. He said, we don't pay you to change effing tires. We pay you to lock assets up and write damn tickets. And that's how he was being judged, by the shift. And so that's how he was judging us. So no, that part of policing, locking people up, making tickets, that's about 15% of the job. 85% is community building. You know, I received Officer of the Year one year, and I was very productive. But the two things that I was most proud of, they didn't say a word. I never drew my gun on anyone. Right. And not only did I not only have a complaint filed at all, but I mean, not complaint sustained, but I didn't have a misconduct complaint filed at all, despite being my most productive year. Nothing was said about it. And so we have to change that mentality. And many officers want to take that approach, but we're not rewarding them for the work that they do. And if we do, we put them in a little community unit, right? They can never make rank. They can't, you know, they never have a chance, a pathway for promotion, right? And it makes it harder to bring in millennials and Gen Zers, what we have now, Gen Alpha and Gen whatever we're at now, right? It makes it harder for them because they want more innovative and community style of policing. And we're seeing the numbers dwindling and dwindling, and it's part because of how we reward officers. And no matter, community police has been around for 20 years, 30 years. It's not new, but it hasn't taken place because the organizations hadn't changed how they reward officers, and it's partly because how cities judge departments. And I think that's the major barrier to doing so. And agencies that were able to be really successful and bridge that gap was ones who removed that trigger, who stopped lower level infractions. Places like in Georgia, who understood that in Georgia, on the risk assessment instruments for parole, a marijuana arrest counted just as bad as a non-fatal, weighted just as much as a more than a non-fatal assault did in Georgia. And so the police knew, well, if we stop making this a arrestable offense, forget the prosecutor, forget the local, forget the state government, forget the federal government, this is what we're gonna do, then we can at least narrow that gap. So it really starts with reducing those contacts and making those contacts more community building, rewarding it, as opposed to making them more sanctions based. And unless we do that, nothing else in my mind will work.
But I really enjoyed, I was reading something about you talking about reducing traditional metrics of performance, meaning reducing the number of citations, or it doesn't mean as much arrest and clearance rates. And I think that's partly what you're saying now. And how do we get there? I know we've been talking about it here for the last 20 years, 25 years, and it just can't quite get there.
Yeah, I'm gonna tell you, it's hard. And I say, we perverted justice. So places like Philadelphia, even mid-sized like Memphis, Atlanta, these places are able to do this because they have larger budgets, right? The city government. Well, in smaller places, like it's a story I was telling my students about in Florida, where even the public defender relies on their money that trickles down from their revenue from fines and tickets and enforcement. And so what we've turned the system as our citizens as a commodity and a means to an end instead of serving them. And so that's really difficult. And that's why when I'm talking about reform, when things happen, they want to look at the police officer or the police chief. This happens under the mayor's watch, under the county mayor's watch, right? These are people who sign expenditures. I mean, hell, our research shows that all the police departments that pay their officers, and we will be submitting it, police departments that pay their officers a higher relative salary composed to others, they see reductions in police lethality for all races. Now you start throwing unions in there, we start seeing differences, and I'll let you all see a copy of that. But it just goes to show that we can't no longer pervert the system, underfund our justice system, and force, many of these grants that states gets from the federal government, they have a hand in it too. It's for traffic enforcement, safe streets and this type of thing, right? It's about that traffic enforcement, making these stops. And so, we can get around it with law, with prosecutors who want prosecuted. We can get around it with local police departments, but places that are severely underfunded. And that's why I think what we see in the pattern of the war on drugs being over for the most part on Black people in the urban areas, but things are starting to change in the rural and suburban areas because they just don't have the budgets. And so I think that's a question that's even bigger than the people who work in the system and at the highest levels that need to make sure are being held accountable. And I didn't really answer your question or have a magic wand, but I really think those are places we should be looking at and stop making the actors the scapegoats because their behavior doesn't happen in the vacuum.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And let me double check on our co-chair. Jimmy, are you back? And Clinton, I know Clinton sort of have to answer a call. All right, Clinton and Jimmy, we are ready to send a big thank you and allow you to close out. Welcome back.
I am back, and I'm sitting in the dark. I'm going to confess, I did not leave the building when the alarm was going off. And so I don't believe there's a fire going on, but I had to go on mute because the alarm was going, but now it's off. Thad, I'm going to call you Thad because you gave me the permission, but not to disrespect your title. Thank you so much for being here and for your lovely partner, Natasha, being here as well. I learned a lot from your presentation. The data was really enlightening, some things that I didn't actually know. And so I'm going to pour over your PowerPoint and we'll be in touch. And thank you so much. And thank you everybody for spending your Friday again with us. Thank you, Clinton, for being here. Alice, for all your support again, and Les for making the connections, Dr. McCurley for suggesting Thad to be with us. Appreciate you all. Take care, be safe, be well, Thank you.